Well. Good evening, everyone. We have a real fun night going on here tonight. We have I know that's probably a strange thing to say, but we have some pretty big topics that we're going to discuss. Obviously, the topic that we have here in the title, the 18th century. We're finally moving on from the 17th century. We've been in the 1600s for oh boy, for a couple of months. But we've been addressing all sorts of aspects of the 16th century, or excuse me, of the 1600s, the 17th century. And as we continue to go forward through time, when we come to the 18th century, we see that for as many overhauls and changes that took place in the 17th century, the 18th century brings us a lot of the challenges that will launch the modern world into something that you and I probably more familiar with. And so when we deal with the issues of the scientific revolution now, and also the radical enlightenment, and some of those things that we are more familiar with in our cultures, and then of course the revolutions that happen at the end of the 18th century, both in America and also in France. Everything that we've come to know from the British Empire, everything like that comes to call here during this time, and a time of exploration, a time of discovery, a time of challenging the way that people think about pretty much everything. And so tonight, when I title this the 18th century, Rethink, Renewal, and Revolt, the main focuses, the main two areas that we're going to be discussing are the radical enlightenment and its impact, basically more in the thought sphere, but then also the ramifications that had in culture, and also in the church. Don't forget, church history class. This isn't primarily a history class, but you cannot talk about church history in the 18th century without at least addressing the radical enlightenment and its effect on how we view church, its effect on how we view the scriptures, and also its effect on how the church's structure itself actually works. And then that will give way. The Radical Enlightenment happens at the same time as the First Great Awakening. We will deal with the First Great Awakening as well, massively tonight. And then we'll end just on the cusp of the American Revolution, if we have time. But I'm not overly confident that we will. It kind of depends on how this goes and what kind of questions we have, if there are any to interact with. So if you do have any questions or jokes, limericks, or encouragements or anything like that, you're welcome to put them in the chat. And but let's get into this: the radical enlightenment and its impact. So when we talk about things like radical enlightenment, or let's just use the term enlightenment. Let's start there. When we refer to the Enlightenment, a lot of people just kind of get into this mind space of thinking of the scientific revolution, the over focus, if you will, on the scientific advances, advances in how the natural world is to be interacted with. And this terminology of enlightenment presupposes, you can just look at the term, it presupposes that people weren't enlightened before it, right? I mean, even from this very time period, everything from the Renaissance to the Enlightenment looks on the medieval period as the Dark Ages. Now we're enlightened. Before we were without learning. Now we are learned. Before we were without this. Now we have this. That cultural element passes through to the church directly. There's no way that the church is going to not be affected by this. It's a cultural movement. All cultural movements affect the church, for good or bad. Doesn't really make any difference as far as for expectations. We know it will affect the church. And so it shouldn't surprise us that while the Enlightenment is going on, the church, especially in the 13 colonies and and in England, are experiencing what is now called, in a very darling format, the First Great Awakening. Again, same type of terminology. In the first half of the 1700s, and I will go back and forth between 1700s and 18th century. I just can't avoid that. The same kind of terminology in the first half of the 1700s, Enlightenment, Awakening. What's the implication? What was before this was asleep. It was dark, now it's enlightened. Now it was asleep, and now it's awakened. That type of terminology is a very it's a very philosophical, very theological, very cultural view of the past in a negative light, and the present and the future in a very positive light. And so the terms themselves, when we talk about enlightenment or the great awakening, those types of things presuppose that what we're coming out of is worse than what we're going into. And so keep that in mind as we kind of wrestle through this stuff. Now, so let's start with the radical enlightenment. Now, I have discussed the enlightenment, right? The enlightenment, kind of the beginning parts of it, was a matter of the 1600s. It isn't until we get really to the 1700s that it can really be well said that we enter the time period of the radical enlightenment. Now, there's distinctives between that. While it's a philosophical and scientific thing, not primarily a church thing, it's important to know that there's a distinction, because the early enlightenment is not in any way atheistic at all. It's not relativistic. It's not, you know, uh, whole hog on there's this huge problem between science and religion. But as we get into the 1700s, for tonight, the radical enlightenment begins to snowball into this understanding that, well, if we can challenge this, then maybe we can challenge that. And if we can challenge all these things, then perhaps we can challenge what all of them are sourced in. And that really becomes for it the perennial frustration of those who are trying to figure everything out is, where does authority rest? Right? If authority is in the church, just let's figure it out. If authority is in the scriptures, let's figure it out, right? That will be the huge, in the West at least, the huge determiner of where you fall. If you're Catholic, you're going to hold that the church is the authority and should hold authority. And so what it says goes. And if you're going to be Protestant, about the only thing that holds all the Protestants together is that we think that the scriptures are higher than the church. And so as far as authority is concerned, the scriptures will be a more significant authority. Well, for the radical enlightenment, there starts to enter in this challenge that maybe the world's not as simple as all that, right? Maybe we're not just wrestling with, who's really in charge, the king or the pope. Maybe we're not just wrestling with whether we should pay attention to Leo or whether we should pay attention to Luther. Maybe it's something much bigger than that. And you can't deny the cultural and the technological advances that lead to all of this. And so when you deal with the early 1700s, what's going on at the same time as thought overhauling is exploration. The age of exploration, the age of piracy, the age of colonialism. And I don't mean any of these necessarily in bad terms. These piracy countries did to each other. Colonialism is just a statement of expanse and a desire to bring certain cultural elements with you. Good parts, bad parts. I'm not here to argue all that. We're just here to describe the reality is that there was all of a sudden a rapid expansion of British and French, Dutch and Portuguese empires throughout the world. They found that the world was much, much bigger. And here's the other aspect: had many more different types of cultures and authority structures everywhere they went. Right? The world is much bigger and a much more diverse series of truth claims and cultures throughout. Additionally, the differences of Christian worship practices only grew. As there had been separations, as there had been uh, wars, as there had been separations between nations, separations between churches and states and national identities, even separations between churches amongst other churches. All of these things that happen inside Europe, all those distinctives, only became more pronounced as they left Europe. And so when you, for instance, right? So Spain is Catholic. If you're not aware, Spain is Catholic. That it just always has been, always will be, right? Spain expands to the New World, obviously makes enormous inroads throughout. England also does this. Now, Spain is Catholic. Um, England is not. It's Anglican. And then you have the Portuguese, but you also have the French. The French are a little bit more confused, but largely Catholic-ish. But then there's the ones that actually make it to the New World are not just Catholic, but also those that the Catholic French monarch kicks out, the Huguenots, largely so called. And so you end up with this kind of mishmash over in the New World, but you have a lot more real estate, right? And so what what was in Europe, your neighbor would be 20 miles away now in the New World. That's just just to draw the comparison for when, with such distances, what differences you have are more pronounced. And this happens throughout the church. This happens in the Protestant world. This happens in the Catholic world as well, by the way. There's a lot of differences that get more pronounced as the days go on. We're going to see that actually kind of a pretty significant rift inside the Catholic Church in the 1700s. Um, Most of this is brought on by the rapid expansion into the world and the exposure to how much stuff is going on in the world. And I don't know another way to put that because I could be more specific, but the reality is it's spices, it's island cultures, it's Eastern religions, it's no religions, then it's in other places animistic religions, and then it's cultures as diverse as being aware of India now. It's being in contact with China, but then it's also being in contact with what's left of the cultures in the New World after all of the smallpox and typhus and everything else went through, and uh, everyone died from a lot of that. But you're seeing cultures that are so incredibly different than anything in Europe. They have different religions, they have different moral codes, they have different habits, they have different way of dress. It's kind of this bizarre thing. And so if you ever go to, this is a cool side part, if you ever go to like an art history museum, right? And you see um, like fashion pictures of people from this time period, the first half of the 1700s, you'll see people all of a sudden, like you'll get these spurts of fashion that include things like turbans on people that are in England. And you go, wait, what's happening? And it's not like this is somebody who is being depicted. No, this would be a right fancy lady in London being painted with a turban on her head. Why is this happening? Well, we ran into and are in contact now with regularity cultures that have a whole different way of fashion, a whole different way of belief, and every time the world takes a leap like that, you're going to enter a time of more relativism when it comes to how things ought to be done, right? For those of you who are, paying attention to anything in the world now, we're actually in a time period like that. The internet has shrunk the world again, and so now we're realizing how close everything is and yet how different everyone is. And it takes time to shake that out. Well, a lot more so if, crossing the Atlantic takes you a month or two or three if it's not favorable, and trying to go around the world. And so the changes will happen, but coming out of those movements will be a little bit shorter and slower. And so there's going to be this increase in relativistic challenge to the assumptions of the Christian faith, right? And so if the Catholics and the Protestants are just constantly arguing back and forth, whether it's the church that has ultimate authority on earth, or whether it's the scriptures that have ultimate authority on earth, or you try to hold both somehow in some kind of contention or whatnot, and then you have people like Voltaire, for instance, who just kind of come up and say, why either of those? Right? Why any of those? In fact, you're gonna get challenges all over the place that, maybe it's not even just that we're trying to figure out what ultimate reality there is in faith. What if faith itself is an aspect of culture? And just like somebody's turban, or just like somebody's outerwear or coats or the colors that people wear and what they mean in different cultures, maybe that's all we're dealing with when it comes to matters of the faith. Well, it's obvious for culture, isn't it? Right? You go to the New World and you found that there were entire cultures that existed without the wheel, for instance. And there's all sorts of reasons for that, lack of domesticatable animals and all sorts of things that led to that. But you have other aspects as well. Cuisine is determined by what climate you're in, whether you're temperate, whether you have, large forests that can handle, you know, big deep stews, or whether you have more bamboo-like things and grasses that burn quickly and you have to chop up everything into small bits and quick fry them. That's Chinese cuisine, by the way. You know, w- your climate, your setting, everything you are and where you are determines so much about culture. Some people start reasoning maybe the same is for the Christian faith. Because not only are we running into different cultures, different ways of dressing, and different laws, we're running into different religions. It's not that people didn't know that there were other religions, it's that they didn't have regular contact with them. And so, not only just the religions of the New World, which were to the European eye quite revolting. I mean, human sacrifice doesn't really sit on the European mindset very well. And so they see this as a need for, not only just fighting against and putting an end to, but also a position for evangelism. Whether you think that's right or wrong is irrelevant. That's what they were looking at there. But when you go to India, you're seeing Hinduism, which is not a new religion, it's an old religion. How do you deal with that? It's able to support a culture. It's able to live somewhat in harmony with itself. You have other thoughts processes of Buddhism. You have other ones that are important throughout the rest of the places that they're going, and people are starting to wonder. People are starting to wonder, and I see this even today. People that haven't dealt very, sternly with this, I suppose, still try to bring out this same idea that, like, wherever you're born, that determines what your religion is. That kind of reality is going away, obviously, as the world kind of becomes smaller and smaller, the more communication that goes on. But with this radical enlightenment and some of the challenges to the authority of the church, to the authority of faith, and of culture, really some of the more base challenges go to the issue of ethics, right? So you get this idea that, there's a certain propriety, a certain amount of clothing someone should wear, for instance. But then you go to the tropics and you find out that, wait a second, this tribe here or that tribe there are perfectly fine with much less clothing than anyone would be, safe with in France or in London or something like this. And so you start to wonder, if that's okay there, why not here? And you can see the relativistic questions coming in. But it doesn't just go to things like that, a propriety. It even goes to things as central as what is in European culture, as central as marriage. You get expanded into and more communication with more cultures that are okay with things like polygamy. That challenges, you know, a lot of assumptions. And the thing about assumptions is they really get baked in, both in churches and in cultures. And when you're in church history studying movements like this that affect the way that people think of the church, or that affect the way that people think of morality and how the issues of authority works, it's always important to pay attention to what are the assumptions, what are the realities, and what is challenging what assumption, right? And so, for instance, in the radical enlightenment, they're not looking to undo everything and to say, hey, let's live without foundations. That doesn't come until the postmodern world. We'll discuss that when we get to the 21st century. But in the radical enlightenment, they're trying to remove anything that could possibly be seen as a relativistic thing, things that are difference between cultures, for instance. And so they say there's got to be some absolutes, something we can just set our hat on, something we can, start building up from the ground. And they've moved beyond where Rene Descartes would be, with his, I think, therefore I am, kind of pursuit of certainties. And so really what the radical enlightenment starts settling down on is this idea that we can apply certain aspects of the natural world that we can build everything on. Rationalism, for instance, science, the scientific method, logic, and how things work seem to be laws not just of our perceptive minds, but of the natural world in which we live. The natural sciences get a huge boost from this, for good reason, a desire to find something that is the grounding principles of the world. There were even full attempts made to create a new type of natural law. For instance, if all cultures believe that murder is wrong, we can deduce that as an absolute, right? No need to have God speaking on this at all. We can it's plain to see, it's self-evident. That kind of language will come out of all of this. One of the problems I'll just say as a theologian is not all cultures actually do hold that murder is wrong. Um, so that calls some questions in. But at this point, all the cultures that they were running into seem to agree with something as basic as that, outside of war, and then that's also debatable. How big can a war be before it's not murder anymore? Um, and then what this really does is provide some very fertile soil for a belief system known as deism. Deism Deism is important to church history simply because it's a parallel movement that's happening. That's the same thing as the Radical Enlightenment. It's something that's going on in the world. It's in the air, the spirit of the age, the zeitgeist. Deism, to put it very simply, is the idea that there is a God who created the natural world, but has since not touched it. And you might go, wait, I mean, why would you want a God like that? Well, the question doesn't come back to, if we want a God like that or not. The reality is that the zeitgeist of the moment, the cultural focus of the moment was to find something that we can hang our hat on with certainty on some level. And if God's out there doing miracles, then we can't use the natural world, right? If God is just breaking rules, natural laws all the time, then that makes nature unpredictable because now we have something supernatural that's happening, that we can't account for and we can't anticipate. And so that really calls into question scientific methods and so forth. What happens if there's a lack of probability on something? What if we start dropping things and they fall at different rates than any rate we've ever seen before? Then all of a sudden we have a natural world that can't be a foundation. It can't be the absolute. And so we'd have to move even the natural sciences into a relativistic framework. We'd have to move even logic into that, because maybe then, if something as basic as the created world can't be depended on, maybe our minds can't be, right? Maybe our logic can't be. Maybe all of it is culturally determined. And again, I will simply point out that kind of thinking doesn't get there until postmodernity. But this is the rise of modernity, nature and nature's God. That is deism. It's this idea that nature is the founding and grounding principle of everything that we can have with some level of solidity. We have to account for the fact that it's here, and so we can say that God created it, but He has since left it alone. And so you'll see very, very quickly, this is going to affect how you interact with the scriptures. This is going to affect how you interact with the church. This is going to affect how you interact with authority, with even the definition of salvation, and if that's even a real thing or even possible. And also, it's going to deal with how you see church. What is it doing? If it's doing anything, right? And so you're going to be getting challenges in theology, in modernist theology, that's going to continue to develop out of these ways of thinking, is to not just downplay the miracles, or the virgin birth or any of these other things. It's to just call them into question entirely. Those things break the natural order. We can't be having people rising from the dead. That's against the natural order. You cannot be having God entering into his creation. And so Jesus can only be just a man. He's a good teacher, right? He's teaching good morals and good ethics, right? And great for our culture type thing. But you can't have him virgin born because that breaks the natural order, right? And so this kind of rise of deism is, it's going to not just call into a question, it's going to deny the miracles of Jesus. It's going to deny the miracles of the prophets. It's going to deny even at a base level, on some level, or on a direct level actually, the inspiration of the scriptures themselves, and therefore the necessity or the effective nature of the Catholic Church, for instance, or even all these Protestant churches. They're good for what they do, but they're not actually working miracles, right? If you remember the way that the Mass is presented, these are miraculous things happening in the Catholic Mass, right? So you go to a Puritan church. Well, what are they saying? They're saying that the ministry of the word and the sacraments, these are the miracles of God, wrought faith into the hearts of his people. Well, deism will come back and say there's none of that. None of that's doing anything outside of just, humans interacting with one another, just very naturalistic concepts, right? And so you have the Radical Enlightenment giving way to a continued rise of deism. It certainly lends fertile soil for that to dwell. In fact, there's a lot of very influential founders of the country I live in, America, that were deists. There was Christians as well, but deism played a large role in a lot of this, right? And so you'll find language in our founding documents that won't be talking about Jesus. It won't be talking about the scriptures. What it'll be talking about is, our rights are endowed by our Creator. That language is very intentional because that's when the rights were given, and God doesn't mess with anything after that. Otherwise, the natural world is unpredictable, right? The authority and challenge issues extend not only to political concepts or cultural concepts, but it will also go straight to how Christians should see the Bible, right? Biblical criticism is a area of thinking and an area of study that began significantly here. At least it got its fullest shove into an area of study here, and that is this idea of not just coming to the text, straight, but you've got to understand the historical climate of the text that it was written in, right? Look at the Bible not only as a religious text, but as a historical document. It can be analyzed, it can be studied. Again, it's part of the natural world. And so we can study it as any other thing in the natural world, just as like if you would, take a finch off of an island, or you'd take an insect off the ground, and you would sit and you would study it and you would figure it out, what made it, how did it come about, and all this kind of stuff. We'll think of scripture this way. I don't want to say that this was a completely novel way of interacting with the scriptures, but it, as far as for a massive movement, this is the first time where we have that kind of level uh, of of interacting with it on a new way, right? It's being analyzed as a natural, productive thing. Understanding in its context, what did the authors think? What were they doing? What kind of process did it all come together with? That kind of historical analysis didn't really exist before this. And again, exposure to scripture before printing presses and vulgar translations, just your own heart language translations in all these different languages, it wasn't necessary before this. But now everyone has access to the scriptures, if you want access to the scriptures by the time the 1700s come around. And so you'll get not only an analysis of it historically, you'll get an analysis of the text as well. The text itself. What kind of translation are we using? Is it a good translation or a bad translation? I mean, in the past, it's just been happy with we had a translation at all. That's amazing. But here now we can start looking at it. There's variations. There's some inconsistencies between some of the manuscripts. What do we do with this? How do we solve that? Rationalism and the challenge, as we've already mentioned, of things like miracles and inspiration and supernatural events. Obviously, the people of Israel didn't really cross the Red Sea. Obviously Jonah wasn't swallowed by a fish. This type of approach to the scriptural text really begins to take hold in the 1700s, kind of a rationalistic approach to it. Nothing to say about being rational is bad. It's not like there's two questions, whether you're a rational Bible reader or an irrational one. There's quite a spectrum there. But it really comes back down to whose authority determines this. And the question really goes unanswered. And it's in some ways, it's not even an answerable question on the cultural side of things. But at this point, you still have church and state linked together pretty much everywhere you go in Europe. You have, obviously, you have a Lutheran Germany, you have a Frenchish France, Frenchish, a Catholic-ish France, you have a very Catholic Spain, you have an Anglican England. All of this to say is there's no real separation between church and state yet. And so if you start challenging the church on things, that's going to start challenging the state on things. And so this when one is brought down, the other gets brought down too. And there becomes this catch 22 of a rejection of all traditional authorities. This really becomes the spirit of the radical enlightenment. Not only am I going to think for myself, not only am I going to decide these things for myself, and the rising of the rational individual, the rising of the rational skeptical individual will just challenge any authority, no matter what it is. And whether that's scripture, whether that's church, whether that's state, who says that the king has a divine right? Who says that he can tax us if he doesn't ask us what we want? Why should we pay attention to that? What if he's out of control? What if he's a tyrant? You can hear already this way of thinking is so saturated in the way that culture is moving, in the way that philosophical thought is moving. It's only more gas to the fire. The further we explore, the more cultures we see. It's a lot to take in all at the same time. The rise of personal translations, the rise, not personal translation, of personal scriptures, the rise of translations into people's mother tongues, the work of more translational efforts just complicates the issue further and further and further. When we come to something that's in the scriptures that's different from what we would anticipate, who gets to decide? Right? What if there's a Protestant understanding of something, and then you have also a Catholic understanding of something? Who determines what? And so the impact of a lot of this really affects not only religion, not only the church, but it affects society as a whole. And it contributes to a lot of the secularization of society and the weakening, at least in most people's mind, of the church's authority. It does lead to a very broadening concept in religious thinking, and so it allows for a lot of different sects. It allows for a lot of different movements to develop how they interact with the scriptures. Um, but it does this by making controversy. It does this by causing a lot of friction. And a lot of people saw this kind of friction not as a positive thing. They actually saw it as a threat to the church. They saw it as a threat to their faith, and that goes across the board. That's not just Catholic, and but that is broadly in the Protestant world as well. That tension between faith and reason really becomes a huge area of study and a huge area of discussion in the modern church, and it will not go away. As we will see throughout history, you will have challenges to this back and forth, especially when we get into the late 1900 or the late 19th century and the early 20th century. This kind of rise of fundamentalism and the trying to deal with science is saying this. Well, science doesn't really speak with a singular voice like that, but there seems to be from the scientific realm this sort of consensus here, this challenge to a scriptural claim here, on the Christian side of it, what do we do with that, right? Obviously, there's all sorts of ways to answer that. We will get into a lot of that when we get there. There is a side part to this that I want to address before we get to the first Great Awakening, and that's one of these aspects of the age of exploration, the rise of nationhood, and things like this. Something that happens inside the Catholic Church, and that was the suppression of the Jesuits. The suppression of the Jesuits. If you are a Protestant and have gone through church history classes, or you've watched or listened to podcasts on church history, you could be sort of forgiven for have never heard about this at all. Because usually, in my experience, when you're walking through church history and you hit the Protestant Reformation right around the time the Puritans, you know, come to their infancy stage, and the Council of Trent meets and basically calls all Protestants heretics. Um, a lot of Protestant church history teachers will just stop talking about the Catholic Church entirely, which is, and they'll put them kind of in the same bin as they will with the Eastern Orthodox back in the 11th century, right? After the Great Schism, we don't talk about the Eastern Orthodox anymore. And then after the Council of Trent, we don't talk about the Catholics anymore. Um, that's I'm going to go ahead and put out here, that's not a good way to do church history. Largely, my focus as a Protestant is going to be the Protestant branch of of the church. Also, all the movements and changes are happening in the Protestant church. So that's, you know, the significant ones that happen at lightning speed. You have much more long history in the Catholic Church. It's a much bigger ship with a much smaller rudder. All the Protestant churches are, you know, pretty agile, smaller ships at this point in history, and so you don't really get that kind of takes a long time to make changes stuff. Now the Catholic Church will catch up to that in the 1800s. Don't count them out yet. They got a lot more stuff to change when they get there. Um, with regards to papal infallibility and the Marian dogmas, and we will cover all of that. Vatican I, Vatican II, and these things, and then some of the modern changes to the Eastern Orthodox Church as well. But you know, if you're part of those, and you're listening to this, understand I'm a Reformed Baptist. My main focus is going to be in the Protestant world, but it is important as one of the larger things that happened in the Catholic Church to make note of this: the suppression of the Jesuits in the 1700s, and it really is endemic to some of the struggles that happen. So it's a really good one to include in. And so if you're not aware of it, I'd encourage you, even if you're Protestant, go look this up. It's such a curious way in which something happened at the requirement of culture that the church does capitulate to and then eventually undo. So it's not overly studied in Protestant circles much, but here I'm going to include it. I think it's really important. I think it gives us a real perspective on the reality of what was going on in Europe at the time, and that is when the Jesuit order. Remember, the Jesuits, also known as the Society of Jesus, founded by Saint Ignatius of Loyola, back during the Protestant Reformations, part of the Counter Reformations, and part of the Council of Trent, the founding of this society that was outside the hierarchy of the Catholic Church and answered to the Pope straight, right, directly. Well, the Jesuit order now has been around for 200 years, right? So Trent is back in the 50s and 60s. When we are up here and we get to the 1760s, the Jesuit order has expanded significantly. It is all over the world. They are huge in the area of education and societal order. They are specifically close to the Pope, obviously, but they had a lot of political clout as well. They had a lot of political power, and there was, with the rise of these new nation states that were coming out of things like the 30 Years' War and the 7 Years' War and all sorts of other stuff that's been going on all the way along, and these just struggles during the colonial periods of we're going to even have wars amongst us overseas. We're going to try to have trade for ourselves back here in Europe, and there's so much tense energy in the air of Europe during the 1700s that anything that even stinks of my enemies over here to the east or to the west or to the north or south, anything that even looks like it's trying to move our political world around for their benefit is going to be seen with quite a suspicious eye. Well, that is a rule across the board. And the Jesuits are the perfect people to lob any accusation at and to let it stick. Because the reality is they had so many political connections, both in Rome and also in each of these countries, that it led to a general distrust of them as an entire unit. Now, the Jesuits were started as a way to assist the church in reforming itself from the inside. The effect of the Jesuits was what is that it kind of expanded the ministry of the church, of the Catholic Church, throughout the world during the Age of Exploration, and so that led to this specific branch of the Catholic Church affecting so much more than it was designed to do, and it did lead to a significant distrust. A lot of distrust to their involvement in the politics, but also their closeness to the Pope, and just the threat that it would have, or the possible perceived threat it could have, on the independence of nations. Obviously, these nations are already dealing with the rise of populist movements, even the rumblings of revolutions before they even happen, the possible overthrow of monarchies, replacement with a newfangled parliamentarian form of government. You've got it over in England. It seems to be working okay. Maybe that should be the norm rather than the exception. Maybe these unchecked monarchies isn't the way of the future. And with that kind of stuff rumbling around politically, and then you have this transnational or supranational organization like the Jesuits, um, who has fealty outside of your nation. If you are a king and you're looking at that, you're not going to be looking at it with a great deal of love and care. And the rise of your national identity, you're no longer just this disparate group of people that kind of speak the same language. Now you have a homeland. Now you have borders. Now they're defined. Now you defend them. You have a king. You have a nation. You have a currency. One by one, the nations of Europe begin banning the Jesuits. It's over an entire decade in the 1760s. And it becomes so politically impossible for them to work in the midst of all of that. While a lot of them do go underground, what eventually has to happen is that the Pope himself will suppress the entirety of the Jesuits um, uh, in 1773. That's Pope Clement the 14th, who's Pope from 1769 to 1774. Not overly significant. It's just his papal brief that suppresses the Society of Jesus in 1773. That's the Jesuits. But the order doesn't disappear. The Jesuits are so ingrained in everywhere that they continue into, let's just put it this way. As for church law, illegal operations, underground operations, that's a nice way to say it. They stay on in faraway places. Now, I want you to see how this works, because this is always the rule with this stuff. It's always the outskirts of the reaches of the empire, but I want you to see how far away the Jesuits continue to work from Rome, because it's not going to be Italy. It's not going to be France or Spain or Portugal. It's not going to be Greece. It's not even going to be into the eastern reaches or anything like this. It's going to go further and further and further away. And so you will actually have underground operations of the Jesuits. And I say underground, don't hear clandestine, don't hear any of that kind of stuff. Just hear the Pope disbanded them, but they said, we still have educational things. We still have schools we have to run. We still have hospitals to affect and help. We still have people to teach, right? The Jesuits were involved with all manner of things. Now, I'm not saying all of it was good, nor all of it's bad. I'm saying it existed. And where it continued existed should show you how far the age of exploration had taken place, because it's places like China and Russia and Prussia and in the colonies and what will soon become the United States. Again, 1773. So we're talking 3 years before 1776 and that Declaration of Independence. That's when the Jesuits are officially suppressed by the Pope in Rome. Now, an interesting part of that is the fact that they stay on in Russia. Now, if you were paying attention a couple weeks ago, you know that the Eastern Orthodox Church, Moscow, is being seen in Russia at this point in history as the third Rome, right? Rome, its original, fell. That's gone. Capital with Constantine moved to Constantinople. That was second Rome. When Constantinople fell in 1453, throughout the 1500s, the establishment of the Russian Orthodox Church is the most significant side of the Eastern Orthodox assembly. Moscow saw itself as the third Rome. And so you look at this and go, wait a second, what are Jesuits even doing in Russia? That's a big question, isn't it? And again, it shows you how far the age of exploration has gone. It also shows you how much interplay and interaction there has been. But a lot of this also is due to the fact that the Jesuits were being used by Russia to support multiple things in the areas of education and social work. Plus, the ruler at the time was a woman named Catherine the Great, which, if anyone's ever looking for a really fascinating character sketch to work on, she's a remarkable person to study. She is obviously Russian Orthodox, but she grew up Lutheran. So she grew up Lutheran. She becomes Russian Orthodox. She becomes the leader of Russia at the time and was a considerable supporter of religious tolerance. And so, just as a side note with that, is kind of something I ran into in my reading of this. Just a fascinating story, and made me want to go and just do an entire study on her story and everything that went on there. So I just think that was fascinating. I will say the official suppression of the Jesuits, was put an end to in 1814, and that restored the Jesuits to its previous provinces and all of its responsibilities as well, and they were able to resume their work again. But that interruption is a really interesting testament to the nature of the way that everything's happening in Europe and in the world largely at that time. Well, let's go on to the First Great Awakening. The First Great Awakening. So the Radical Enlightenment is taking over kind of scholastic thought throughout. And that's kind of always what happens. Whatever new idea comes around, it runs through everybody, and everyone's gloms onto it because it's cool, it's new, you can get published and recognized. And then as we digest the idea, hopefully the bad ideas die away, the good ideas live on, right? If you're not, again, realizing, we're going through that again right now in our culture with postmodernity, the rise of transgenderism, and things like this. That kind of idea, uh, you know, runs through everything. Everyone's in favor of it all of a sudden that disagreed with it 15 years ago. And then how do we digest that through? And again, the hope is that the good aspects of it will survive the test of time, and the bad aspects of it will die away with the passing of history. The same thing with pretty much any idea or any belief system, hopefully. But the reality is, some bad things live on and some good things die away. And what are you going to do? So when we come to the First Great Awakening, again, it's an editorial on what we're thinking about when we refer to it as the First Great Awakening. And so, yeah, all three of those words are so important. There's the first, which means it's not the last. There's another one coming, at least another one. Great. It's beyond anything normal. It's an exceptional moment in history and awakening. Everything else before it was dead asleep, right? So, um, none of that's really overly honest. All of it is very much editorializing this kind of idea that one, there needed to be something awoken from, is very much a cultural thing. I think you can see that with the fact that this also coincides with the Enlightenment. The First Great Awakening, I want to get my quote on this right because I don't want to be misquoted on this. The First Great Awakening was largely a cultural thing, not a spiritual thing. Now, cultural things can become spiritual things. I don't have any problem with God using anything. But to deny that this had cultural ramifications is just to, yeah, I don't know, close your eyes entirely. It is part of everything that's happening in society. It doesn't mean to call it bad. It's not, and it's not necessarily good. It's means to say that this has aspects of everything else that's going on in culture. It shouldn't surprise us that we see something like the First Great Awakening in the 1730s, 1740s, and that's really where the setting of this is. So let's kind of settle into it a bit, and then we'll talk about the important figures of this, because that really is a significant thing for us to pay attention to. So there's three main effects. If you're taking notes and you want kind of just the overview of this, there's three main effects of the First Great Awakening. One is it's very instrumental in the rise of what we will call fundamentalism in the 1800s, specifically the mid to late 1800s, um, and a number of other movements as well. Obviously, also the Second Great Awakening. Obviously, it'll lead straight into that eventually, but suffice it to say that now it'll be instrumental in the rise of fundamentalism in the 1800s. So this will come up again. But also, one of the things that the First Great Awakening does is it aids the common person to consider a populist idea of the church and society as a whole. Now, let me kind of unpack that for a second there. Um, the 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 aspects of the Great Awakening, of the First Great Awakening, happen at a time when culturally there are populist upheavals, and there are attempts to establish kind of a new societal order, a new way of thinking about how the world works, what our position is, what position we are in the middle of it, how the church is to work, how the scriptures work, and as we're in the new world. Obviously, the First Great Awakening largely is an aspect of New England and the 13 colonies, um, mostly to the northern side. There were some effects of it down Virginia. We'll mention those quickly, but um, it's largely a very colonial thing here in the Americas, trying to address what kind of world are we going to make over here. You know, we left a warring church state versus church state world in the back in the old world. What are we going to do here? I mean, here it's not like you have one country next to another country and they each have their own church. Here, you could actually literally be living next door to somebody who does not share your religious convictions at all. Now what are we supposed to do, right? And so this kind of a granulation of belief, a granulation of movements, this populist concept of not only the church now and its beliefs, but also of society as a whole. If I can live next door to a Lutheran as a Presbyterian, and then we have both of those churches here. Well, it wouldn't be largely Lutheran yet, not really until Pennsylvania, but um, you know, whatever the case may be, a rise of certain different ways of doing church, different ways of living the Christian life, different ways of seeing your responsibility to culture. All of that is going to have to be wrestled with during this century, and we will talk at length. I mean, we're going to spend an entire night on Pennsylvania alone. because it's so different than anything that's been tried before. This is again just an overview, right? First Great Awakening, we're going to see effects of this all throughout, but it really does aid in this kind of new American culture that maybe we can not only rethink the way that the church works, maybe we can revolt against our monarch. It does aid that concept. Even just this idea that the First Great Awakening wasn't happening inside church buildings largely, but they were in open air meetings. It never happened in Europe. Yeah, and we look at that and we go, "Oh, it's, church on the park. That sounds quaint." That didn't sound quaint to people. That was, "Wait a second. You're trying to do the ministry of the word, and you're not even in the church building. You're not even on the pulpit." It's kind of like trying to do, well, it's really not, but it would be akin, at least allegorically or analogically, to trying to do transubstantiation without the altar stone, right? You're trying to do all of this, but then you've removed us from the setting in which it's ought to happen. But then the question comes up is, why is the ministry of the word? Why is it ought to happen on a pulpit? Why can't it happen here in the middle of a field? Why not? And more importantly, and is there ever a more American response than this? Who's going to stop us? There's no power, there's no structure, there's no anybody that can put an end to this. And you will find that it's not just happening in one denomination. It's not just happening amongst the congregational churches or the confessional Calvinistic churches or the Dutch Reform or the Lutherans or the excuse me, or the Baptists. It's not just happening in those groups, it's happening across the board. And they're all at these open air preaching things together. You can see how it adds to a very different way that religion is going to take hold in the Americas. And this is why I pay attention to America so much for the tail end of the walkthrough of church history. It's not because there aren't Christians elsewhere in the world. I want to try and dispel that right now. It's that when you walk through history, where the changes are happening is where you should be paying attention, because that's where things are going to be affected for time and for the next century. Well, the Americas, because of the fact that anyone can do anything here, you can come and stake your claim. You want to trap beavers and then build a church, you can do it. And nobody can tell you anything otherwise. I mean, there were attempts in the early days because, you got, state churches, like an individual state would have a church, but that kind of stuff shakes out pretty quick. And we start to learn that there's a very American way of doing stuff, and it is a hodgepodge mishmash of craziness. And the First Great Awakening is the first place where we start to realize that we're not. I was gonna say we're not in Kansas anymore. Maybe this is the first time where you just go like, "What is this place?" And you learn that it is Kansas. We're not in Europe anymore. We've got something very, very different going on here, right? So that would be kind of the second thing that the First Great Awakening affects. So you had it was instrumental in the rise of fundamentalism, as we'll get to that later. But then this rise of this populist idea of both how you do church and how you do society, it lends a lot to that. The third area is that it brings pietism into the mainstream in America. Something that, we discussed pietism last time. Pietism itself, at least as we currently study it, largely came out of southern Germany and Lutheran piety. But when it came to the Americas, and largely through German immigration, because German immigrants were the largest source of immigrants at this time period. When pietism really set to shore here, it took hold because it naturally. Now, okay, I want to be very careful about how I say this. As to why things take hold, because that's kind of a huge claim. It it shouldn't surprise us that pietism took hold so well in the American colonies, because pietism and its very individualistic focus, its its more involvement emotionally, um, and these types of aspects of pietism really, really sit well in the American mindset. It does. It sits well in the American mindset because the reality is, yeah, we can hold the right ideas and all of this kind of stuff, but who really wants to come and just hear theology all the time? Pietism can help challenge us in other ways, right? Think with me on this. 1730s, 1740s. If you live here and you're willing to work, you will be rich. Most people don't think about this time period, right? This is a land of virgin forests. You can build ships, you can trap furs, you can hunt, you can scratch a living for yourself out in the middle of nowhere and do just fine because, again, in front of us is hardly any resistance whatsoever. You say, well, what about the, Native Americans? What about the Indians? Things like this. Look, the reality, at least worldview wise, of how people were thinking, you got to realize that when the colonists came here, they were not coming to a fully staffed or fully developed, or even beyond that, a fully lived in continent. For practical purposes, in the early 1700s, late 1600s, this was a largely empty continent. And you say, the Indians were here, all the different Indian tribes and things like this. True, but the reality was in the 1500s, you had all of the plagues from the old world came and wiped out the indigenous tribes largely. And the estimates are simply astounding at how things like smallpox and typhoid and things like this destroyed everything in the 1500s here in the New World as far as the natives were concerned. Um, and when I say destroyed, I mean decimated. The estimates at this current point are that when Columbus landed in the Caribbean in 1492, that throughout North and South America there was approximately 90 million natives. That's a lot of people. 90 million is huge. We have massive. I'm actually reading a book right now that completely separate from church history. That's a fascinating book called 1491. I'd recommend, if you're curious about this area of history, before any Western involvement here, what did this world look like? Really curious stuff, really fascinating. Anyway, the estimates right now are that there is about 90 million people living here in the North and Central and South America. And then over the course of the next years, the sicknesses alone, forget the stories of the conquistadors and things like this for just a second, and hear the numbers of those who died from plagues. 90%. Upwards of 90%. That's out of 90 million, 81 million. That is, when I say decimating. They had no immunity to any of these things. We didn't quite have germ theory figured out yet in the 1500s. We didn't understand any of this kind of stuff. We didn't understand that somebody could be a carrier of plague. That's what these guys were on the ships, and bring it and infect people when you yourself was not sick. It wiped out the indigenous population in vast quantities. And so what we're looking at when we come to like the American frontier in the late 1600s, early 1700s is remnants of what once was great nations. Huge. I don't mean great as in like moral. I just mean great as in significant. And yeah, there was wars and battles going on. Yeah, was there wars and battles that went on, the French and Indian War and all this kind of stuff? Yeah, all the way up until like, yeah, 115, years ago. What year is it? 130 years ago. That kind of stuff went on throughout history, of course. There's all sorts of things like this. Atrocities on all sides everywhere, understood completely. But the reality was, and this is why I'm talking about this for church history, when people started looking at expanding out to the West, and that really takes hold in the 1800s. But here in the 1700s, even when you start talking about, you know, um, the kind of wealth that you could have, is you are stepping into a continent that is largely unoccupied. Yeah, are you going to deal with problems here, there, and whatnot? Oh yeah, but you have a gun to deal with that. Right? And so this is kind of the American mindset. The colonies are rich. If you work hard, you will make it very, very well. There's raw materials everywhere. Old growth forests. We've all of a sudden got things like moose, megafauna that we've never seen anything like that out in Europe, right? We don't have anything of even close to that. And then but you also got bears too, because that's another problem. But you have raw materials, you have a perfect climate in some of the colonies for growing of cotton. And because the advancements in textile industries back in Europe have taken off, in fact, especially in Britain, uh, all of a sudden cotton is a hot commodity. This also lends to the significant increase in slavery in the Atlantic slave trade, because if you need cotton, there's not the inventions yet to pull the seeds out of the cotton. That has to be done by hand. That is hugely uh, time sucking kind of labor. And so the cotton industry booms because the demand for new styles of clothes, new textiles in Europe is exploding. And everyone who can do anything here in the Americas, here in the colonies, can become wealthy very quickly. Slavery is a huge part of that. Because of all of this, the colonies really become a melting pot, even not only just of ideas, but even of denominations. And the First Great Awakening is kind of the first part of that. The idea that you can have somebody who is Baptist sitting at a field where an Anglican, preacher is preaching, and you're also sitting next to, somebody who, isn't really even going to church at all. He's just a trapper that happened to hear and wondering, what's this guy screaming about over here? Like, it's kind of a remarkable thing. That kind of stuff hasn't really happened before. Especially in North America, this takes hold really significantly. A lot of about the First Great Awakening is focused on an emotional appeal to the hearers. A lot of it was kind of seen as this um, loosening, if you will, or this untethered way that we can pay attention to what God has said. Most of this will come from very, very solid teachers in their own right. Um, People like George Whitefield would be this, booming voice of a man, um, and great theologians like Jonathan Edwards. Right, Jonathan Edwards I think it can be even said hands down, and that includes secularists. Jonathan Edwards is perhaps the best mind that America has ever made. And I wonder how close that would even be for a second. His writings, his not even it doesn't even really come down to style either. It's just the depth of dealing with these things. Um, he was just a very unique mind, and a very influential mind as well. He's still considered one of the greatest theologians in American history. You may have heard from him. If you don't know him from this, I don't know how you would have known him elsewise, but one of his most significant or most popular, that's not really, one of his most well-known sermons is Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God. And that kind of gives you a little bit of a picture into this part of the First Great Awakening, right? That's, it's got their pictures of of you, being held by this one little thread over the fires of hell, right? I mean, that is not a, hey, let's sit down and talk about the penal substitutionary atonement of Christ or anything. No, that is an emotional appeal, right? That is working on the emotions of fear, of self-preservation. And this is what the First Great Awakening really was really a unique part of this. And so when I say it brings pietism to mainstream America, the appeal to the emotional side of things is going to be a new way of doing things. Jonathan Edwards hugely emphasizing the sovereignty of God, but also the need for personal conversion and for experiencing your religion. You can't just be that you go to church and you say the right stuff and all is well, whether you realize it or not, or and that's going to be very different from medieval theology. Right? This is going to be something that you have experience in. Um, and a lot of his sermons will appeal to the emotions. They will use imagery that is invoking of not only the mind but also of the heart, and that was kind of the goal. um George Whitfield, so Jonathan Edwards, born 1703, dies 1758, so you can have his dates there. Remarkable figure, someone worth spending more time on, but I'm not going to. Um, as we go through church history in this period, we're simply going to be inundated with so many different people that I can't really slow down and look at every one of them. But Jonathan Edwards is certainly one worth going and reading some more about. George Whitfield is partnering with him, or excuse me, is partnering with another man named John Wesley. They're all working kind of at the same time, all kind of working towards the same similar goal. George Whitfield and John Wesley together work to found what becomes the most significant uh, church structure in the United States, and that is the Methodist Church. George Whitfield himself is an Anglican, but he's not just an Anglican minister, he's an evangelist. And he's the one with this booming voice that is, out in these fields and able to speak. Now, again, no microphones, no amplifiers, and yet speaking to 10,000 people. I'd like to see anybody in the modern world have a voice that can do that. Um, George Whitfield was well known for his extremely lively preaching style, shall we say, and made a lot of traveling tours through the colonies. Everywhere he went, large crowds, very revivalistic, very pietistic, very emotionally charged. Benjamin Franklin actually had gone to one of his open air sermons, and he was just like, I don't know why I all of a sudden had this desire to put money in the plate, and he'd almost try to make a Christian out of me. And it's kind of funny to hear, of different historical figures interacting like that. Um, Whitfield was the one that was the pioneer of open air preaching, and a lot of his sermons really focused on this, the need for a new birth through faith in Christ. A lot of it focused on this deep overhauling that salvation should be. And you can even hear in this, right? Hear how American this concept is. We're not going out and assuming all of you are Christians. This is new, right? I mean, not totally new, but largely new. At least on a countrywide type of thing. This is really hard, right? So if you settle down in Spain in the 1500s, and you go down and go, oh, you a Christian? They'd look at you like you got two heads. Of course, I'm a Christian, Catholic. I'm Spanish. It would be akin to asking if you're a human. There's not really a separation in the mindset like that. But here in the Americas, look at this uh this focus on the need for salvation and real felt salvation, a new birth through faith in Christ, right? This kind of this emotional appeal to people. That is very American. Let's put it that way. And George Whitefield was very good at it. And there's a lot of people that came just for that. Well, he was a friend of Charles Wesley, which he went to school with, and his brother John Wesley. Both of them you will undoubtedly have heard of before, whether from their many hymns that they wrote, but also for the founding of Wesleyan thought and the Methodist Church, between John Wesley and George Whitefield. Now they're kind of strange partners in something like this. They have significant differences. John Wesley is not Calvinistic in any way, but George Whitefield is. But there was kind of this agree to disagree arrangement that they ended up with, right? And it's for the fact that, especially in the Americas, we're dealing with so many very wealthy people that they become so religiously stagnant that it's kind of like, let's set aside some of our theological differences and let's just get these people to care about Christ. And so you'll get people like John Wesley, who, uh, theologically is different than George Whitefield. They're both Oxford educated, but they're different, right? Wesley's not Reformed; he's Arminian. Whitefield is Anglican. Very Reformed. And so you'll have a lot of differences and a lot of disagreements between the two of them. Um, but then you'll have working side by side, kind of agreeing to disagree. They become far more committed to revivalist preaching, rather than focusing on higher points of theology. Um, what happens eventually is that Whitefield will help found the Calvinistic Methodists, and it becomes what is known as the Presbyterian Church of Wales. That, if you're not familiar, Martin Lloyd-Jones, he was out of that branch of Presbyterianism. That is back in the obviously back in the United Kingdom. But in the Methodist world, in the New World, you've got all sorts of dealings with this focus on sanctification, um, uh, and this whole idea that John Wesley will latch onto and bring kind of into the public mindset of God's prevenient grace, God making people savable, and now we go out and we enact that in some way or another. There's a way to appeal to people that can bring them to salvation. You won't necessarily have George Whitefield looking at it like that. Um, you know, um, and But you will have this kind of agree to disagree with the two of them together. And so much so that when George Whitefield died in 1770, it was John Wesley who gave his eulogy. And so that kind of shows you that you'll get a lot of issues out of the First Great Awakening, which is how much revival is too much, or how much emotional appeal is too much. And so you'll have, again, same kind of debates. It won't be about high theology, it'll be about the practicals of revival preaching and things like this. And so if you're curious, we're not going to cover them in any grave detail. There's two other names that, if you want to do additional reading on the First Great Awakening, and I knew we weren't going to get to the revolutions tonight, but if you wanted two additional names on the First Great Awakening, they're Gilbert Tennant. If you're taking notes, Gilbert exactly as it's just like Dilbert, but with a G. And then Tennant is Tennent. He's a Presbyterian minister in New Jersey. About the same time, kind of toward this tail end of the First Great Awakening, midpoint to tail end. He was a leading figure of what was called the New Side faction of a schism within the Presbyterian Church, made by the Great Awakening. He really broke a lot of ranks with what was seen as more stodgy side. Emotionless would be at least the appeal against them. His sermons were more for the personal experience of conversions, and the dangers of just an intellectual faith. That would be Gilbert Tennant. Interesting figure, somewhat minor compared to people like Jonathan Edwards and George Whitefield and John Wesley, but still a significant person to make mention of. Another one is also a fascinating one, an evangelical Presbyterian preacher named Samuel Davies. He's interesting because he's not in New England or even in New Jersey. In fact, he's all the way down in Virginia, and he played a really interesting role in spreading the Great Awakening into the Southern colonies. Again, not talked about very much, but a lot of his contribution to this is important because when you're down in Virginia and in the Southern colonies, um, he's of particular note because he has to deal with the issue of what to do with the African slaves that are all over the colonies there, especially in the South. Um, Samuel Davies considered it impossible to convert somebody without them hearing and reading the Word of God. That was a personal conviction of his, and he valued the salvation of slaves as much as freemen. In fact, so he began, because he had this belief that somebody would have to both hear and read the Word of God. He began educating with education intensives, teaching slaves how to read. And now you got to understand time period we're talking in. This is not popular stuff. We're talking 1750s, 1740s, 1750s here. He is baptizing African slaves. He's welcoming them to the communion table. They are in church with them, and even had those who are learned enough to preach in his pulpit. A fascinating man named Samuel Davies, certainly worth mentioning and certainly worth some reading. The interesting part is he did not live to very old. He was born 1723 and died 1761, 38 years old. But a fascinating person that certainly deserves to be mentioned, if for no other reason than a very unique contribution to the First Great Awakening, and especially dealing with the um, largely unique growing issue that slavery was in the colonies. And we'll deal with that as a church theological question here in the weeks to come. No doubt, it's kind of unavoidable. Um, with that, I'm going to bring this lesson to an end. We will not get into the revolutions tonight. I didn't know if we were going to be able to get through all of the three of them, but at least to get to the Radical Enlightenment and the First Great Awakening, I think that's a good start for us. So, without further ado, my thanks to you all, and I look forward to next time being with you all again. Signing out. Lord's blessings to you all.